What's up, everyone? Welcome to the 6th episode of the Bacon on Everything podcast. I'm your host, as always, Blaine Costas, and today I'm going to talk about something that the world seems to be talking about these days, and that's the Tiger King Netflix documentary series or whatever. So first off, I just wanted to let you guys know that these are all my opinions of the show. It's going to be a quick review, just a couple of notes about the show and the characters and what I think is true from false, but again, this is all just my opinion, so nothing is based on fact. None of this is based on really anything other than I watched the show over the span of a day. I literally watched it overnight and then woke up in the morning, finished it, and that was it. But yeah, so like I'm saying, again, this is all conjecture and all my opinion, so please don't take it with anything other than a grain of salt. But without further ado, let's get into it. The topics that I'm going to be covering for today are, first of all, it's going to be a general review at the very end. I'll give you guys probably a score out of 10, but hopefully the words that I tell you over the next half an hour or so are more important than the score that I give at the end of the episode. But again, the things that I'm going to be talking about today are Joe Exotic himself, Carole Baskin, the husbands, which I think is something that needs to be covered, but I'll get into that, and who's in the right versus who's in the wrong, essentially, between Carole Baskin and all the Tiger Kings, I guess. There's more than just Joe Exotic. I think Doc Antle should be considered a Tiger King as well. Another topic is going to be how guilty is Joe Exotic and how guilty is Carole Baskin, and like I said earlier, at the very end I'm going to give you a quick score out of 10 of what I score this series on Netflix. So without further ado, let's get into the first topic, which is Joe Exotic himself. Now, I think Joe Exotic, first of all, I haven't looked this up. Again, this is all just my speculations, but I think he thought that this show would go along something like Making a Murderer, and would kind of paint him in a light where people were to have polarizing convictions on whether or not the person is guilty or not. So with that being said, like, Joe's, in my mind, the only reason why he agreed for the show to go on is for two reasons, and one of them is he wanted fame, and we see that throughout the show. We see how much he's willing to do for fame, and two, he wanted to, I don't know, sort of make his case seem out in the open. Now with that being said, he's very, very strategic, Joe, and he clearly is smarter than he may be perceived, at least in like social media and on like memes and stuff like that. Like, if you watch the show, you see how calculated this guy is and how he's able to move pieces just with a quick flip of an idea, and how he was so quickly to get onto the whole like YouTube, or I think they said back then it was like MySpace or whatever, but just the idea that he was so ahead of his time that he was already trying to make these shows and have a semi-regular scheduled show. And even when he hired, or that producer came and was like, hey, I want to film you for a reality TV show, he was like, yeah, fine, that's cool, but more importantly, I want you to run my online show. I think that alone shows how calculated he is, and how maybe he put too many eggs in the wrong baskets, but he was so forthcoming with what he wanted and how he wanted things to be done and what he wanted to be perceived as. And I don't think you ever saw Joe be like insecure or not know or have his finger on the pulse until the very end of the show, where it seems like he's kind of spiraling, but we'll get to that after. I think with Joe, he's one of those characters that like you love to watch, but you don't really love him, essentially. They didn't show any redeeming qualities of Joe. They didn't, which is why I don't believe that he would have signed up or agreed to the show unless he had some sort of stipulation as to how this was going to help his image, or how this was going to help him with his cases or whatever. But I think that it's important to see that clearly the show was made and he didn't have the biggest say in it, or at least at the end, maybe somewhere down the line they took him out, and I'm not sure. I'm sure you can find an article online about how Joe Exotic doesn't like the way that he's portrayed, because that's normally what happens in these shows. So with Joe, it's super interesting that he's willing to, or at least what was captured on film, was a lot of pieces of his life put together. I feel like this guy is 95 years old because his life seems like it's been so long. But yeah, Joe seems super manipulative. He seems super like deceiving. He's overtly like criminalistic in what he does in different situations. So for example, with bringing on can't remember his name, but whatever, for bringing on the guy from Vegas who then ended up taking the whole, spoilers, he took the whole I should have said this earlier, spoilers for the show Tiger King. So back into it. The guy who took the zoo from him, that guy was clearly not in any way, shape, or form a clean-cut businessman. Like, he seemed extremely sketchy, and whether it was because Joe was at a financial point where he was strained on his money, or it was because Joe thought that, hey, you know what, this zoo doesn't matter so much anymore as much as my online presence, or I need somebody to take over certain aspects of the business, whatever it is. Joe brought in this guy who he could tell, or anybody could tell, was shady, along with his right hand man who was also shady. Like, I think Joe, we've seen, has a decent, not judge of character, but a perception of character, if that makes any sense. I don't think he's good at judging characters. I think he's easily able to see people for who they are. Whether or not he thinks they're good or bad, I think that's like a different question, but I think he's able to see them for at least who they are, which makes it super interesting that he would bring on this guy who you can tell, I can tell from one episode that this guy's shady and there's something weird about him, and maybe you should look into that, which again is just one of those, I don't know, topics for later when we're talking about how guilty is Joe Exotic. But yeah, so I think bringing on certain characters into the show were definitely strange decisions on his part, but at the same time you see from all the other characters and all the other people working on the zoo that he'd like to involve himself with like people who society have given up on, or whatever you want to say. I think his name is Saf. Yeah, I think his name is Saf, the character who gets his arm bitten off. So he seems like the most logical person at the, we're gonna call it a ranch, but no, it's a zoo. Okay, so he seems like the most logical person at the zoo, other than the fact that he got his arm bitten off and then was back to work in 7 days, which is insane. Like, I don't even understand how you would, but then again, these people are living in such weird constraints, and clearly it wasn't really an option for him to not be at work, right? So there's that. But the fact that Joe kind of connects these characters that are on the low and having a hard time. I mean, we don't really need to talk about Travis right now, but for the most part, Travis was one of those situations. But it seems like Joe has this kind of tendency to bring in either shady people or people who he can easily take advantage of, which make Joe a certain kind of character himself. The next topic, or the next point at least, these aren't topics in Tiger King is the topic for today, but the next point that I wanted to talk about is Carole Baskin. So obviously you've seen memes or videos or something to do with Carole Baskin and how she killed her husband. Let's just get it out of the way. I do believe so. I believe that she killed her husband in some way, shape, or form. What I feel goes and helps those facts we'll talk about afterwards, and how guilty is Carole Baskin. But for the most part, she seems like a very, very opportunistic person. Like when they tell the story about how she met the husband that she's questioned for the murder of, she essentially met him while being married to somebody else, but she was on a walk after an argument. She met him and saw it as an opportunity to maybe upgrade her life. Maybe she had real feelings for this guy. Maybe she saw his money. Whatever she did, she saw that as an opportunity to get to the next level, or get herself closer to her dreams or whatever it is. And then they're not very clear about who had the obsession with animals first. They don't say if it's Carol Baskin or if it's her husband, whose name is escaping me, but essentially what you're given is you're given a character who's easily able to manipulate people and see opportunities and use them for the better of herself. So for me, that's Carol Baskin in a nutshell, and we see that time and time again. We see her ability to subvert expectations on what she is and who she is, and able to manipulate and maneuver her way through different things, like getting PETA involved, but also getting funding and backing from PETA and people that feel like these tigers should be protected, when she's essentially running the same thing that Joe Exotic is, just without the cubs, right? For as much as they've shown, they don't show whether or not I don't know if these tigers are sterile or not able to recreate, but pretty sure Joe Exotic's are and Doc Antle's are, so I'm assuming hers are too, which means that she would have cubs at some point, which means that she would probably be profiting off of cubs too. But yeah, again, getting into sublantics and kind of a run-along statement, but with Carol, it's pretty easy to see that she's able to use, and to an extent, she's able to do what Joe Exotic does better than Joe Exotic. She's clearly able to get an online following easier than him. She's clearly able to subvert and, like I said earlier, maneuver in between whether or not what she's doing is right or wrong, and she's able to keep the public eye off of her for a certain amount of time, but then bring it back onto her when she feels the need. It's strange, because if you were to give a pitch for this show, I would just say it's the Tiger King versus the Tiger Queen or whatever. She's essentially the better version of Joe Exotic, with she's less of a liability to an extent. And her staff, from her staff, like, she uses volunteers, which are the complete opposite of what Joe Exotic uses, because he uses people who, for lack of a better term, don't have the greatest history or the greatest past, and she uses volunteers, people who are going out of their way to show that they're good, and like Joe Exotic uses people that have to show that they're good or they jeopardize their future. Like, it's crazy to see the differences in the two, but see how similar they are. Joe Exotic obviously has some sort of connection with, like, the drug kingpin and somebody who's not supported by the government. What's his name? Mario Tabuli or something like that. The guy who said that Scarface was essentially created after him, was like, he was the inspiration for Scarface, which, I haven't really looked up, but that's a pretty huge call. But either way, these are the kind of people that Joe Exotic hangs out with, and then you see who Carol Baskin hangs out with, and they're very, very different people. They are volunteers, they are like businessmen and congress people, and she's able to walk into the White House or whatever and have conversation with people on passing bills, on doing this, when meanwhile Joe Exotic is trying to get into the White House or trying to become the governor or the president, and he's doing all these crazy things to get more and more attention, when Carol Baskin is using her attention to kind of pull the veil back over people's eyes and have her way and have her cake and eat it too. So it's very, very interesting. So the next topic, and this one is going to be really quick. I'm just going to mention what I think. I'm going to move on from it, are the husbands. So I think it's pretty clear that we could see throughout the show, they don't really portray the idea of the husbands and Joe being in like a actual relationship. Again, with like Travis, and like, rest in peace, but his story was he was a runaway kid, or at least he was a kid who wasn't living at home. He got to, in his words, not verbatim, but in his words, he said something along the lines of, yeah, I gotta hang out with tigers all day and it's pretty cool, so why not? And so I think between the idea that Joe likes to pick up people who maybe aren't their best selves, and then also we can tell by certain things of evidence that There were drugs in and out of the zoo, probably mostly in, and whether that be something that's on site or that's something that Joe would bring on for the whatever the case is. Like we saw in what's the other husband's name? The other husband, we saw in the fact that he was missing 95% of his teeth. Like that's a sign of people who do meth. We see in Travis that like he's clearly unhinged and not 100% there, and he doesn't have like the common discerning in most of the times that you see him. Like you see him and he's just like chilling on a rock, or he's out in the water shooting. Like they tell him to do his job and he doesn't do it. He just isn't like present, at least. And whether or not his death was a suicide or not, like I think that it's either some sort of like he was either mentally ill or he was having a hard time coping, and so he did drugs to kind of escape, and then which then again goes back to being mentally ill. But maybe he wasn't there physically because he could have been high, he could have been like, it could have been a mistake and it could have been a suicide. It's very possible either way. So we can see that these characters aren't the greatest at making decisions. Joe Exotic gets them really high, makes them believe that they're in love. Like the other guy not only got somebody pregnant in the show, he's also, I believe, married to another staff member now. So right after, he then went back to his ways of being straight, essentially. So the question then is, was he ever gay, or was he ever in love with Joe Exotic? And if he was, then like how was he able to break it off? Or at least they didn't show us that it was hard for him to break it off, or that it was hard for him to continue his life without Joe Exotic. So yeah, I think there's a sense of maybe again opportunity from Joe Exotic. Sees these guys, they're not in the best shape. Here's some drugs, here's a way to get you hooked, here's a way to get you to stay with me. I get my emotional benefits, I get my sexual benefits, I get somebody to work on the ranch with me or the zoo with me. Like you can see why he would take this as a benefit. So let's quickly jump into who's in the right. I think it's very tough to talk about who's in the right and who's in the wrong without saying that it's based on your opinion. So to me personally, when it comes down to animals in captivity, animals being in zoos, I'm not PETA, but I'm also not for it. Like I don't think that what either of these people are doing is right. I don't think that, like, I think that there's a different avenue. There's Carol Baskin could easily be training and helping these animals go back into the wild, but that's not something that was portrayed in the show. It was portrayed in the show that she would take them to this tiger sanctuary and then open that up to the public, which to me is the exact same thing. Essentially, I know it's not, but essentially it's the same thing as what Joe Exotic and Doc Antle do. She doesn't really portray the idea that like these funds are going anywhere else other than back into her operation and back into her pocket. Like she's making a lifestyle off of the same thing and on a grander scale than Joe Exotic, and she has the backing of people like PETA. She's the backing of, I mean, anybody who really is against Joe Exotic, whether that be politically or whether that be financially or whether that be, I don't know, because of what he believes in. So it makes it very tough for you to say that what Carol Baskin is doing is different than what Joe Exotic is doing, and who's in the right and who's in the wrong. I truly believe both of them are in the wrong. I think when it comes to certain things that we're going to discuss in the next two topics with how guilty are they, I think that's where you're going to see the clear division of who's wrong for what. I don't think either of these people, any three of these people are in the right, including Doc Antle. But, I mean, at the end of the day, you kind of have to take it and look at it all in a grand scheme of things and say, this isn't a documentary or story about moral high grounds or who's right or who's wrong. It's a documentary which is, in my opinion, based off of fact and what we see. And I think the better a documentary is, the more likely they are to show you a black and white picture than a picture that's covered with opinions and different articles from different people from different sides of the fence. Like, this documentary in my mind was really good at just telling you, like, these are what we know, these are situations and events that happened. You be the judge to decide whether or not you think that they're right or they're wrong. But at the end of the day, like, your opinion isn't like the court of law. It's just your opinion, and that's what I think is very interesting about shows on Netflix like this. So we're gonna hop into how guilty is Joe Exotic and how guilty is Carole Baskin. So first off, like I said before, I believe Carole Baskin killed her husband. I believe she then orchestrated a plan to have his body disposed of properly. I think she orchestrated a plan to have doubt put into the minds of people on whether or not he did leave or whether or not he died and where he is exactly. I don't understand how it could be such an open case for so long. And that being said, I listen to a lot of true crimes. There's lots of open cases. However, with somebody in the public spotlight like she is, you would figure at some point, if she didn't want to clear it up, then somebody should have been looking at it. Like, if she didn't want to have it be a definitive answer of no, she did not kill her husband and there are no questions and this is the story and this is exactly what happened and this is evidence to prove that he's in Costa Rica or whatever, she should have cleared that up if she's going to be in the public eye. And if she didn't want to clear it up, then somebody should have been asking these questions a long time ago about why doesn't she want us to dig into this and why doesn't she want us to find out the facts and prove everybody wrong, because maybe there are some facts that she doesn't want to be uncovered. So there's these kind of questions that should have been asked earlier on in, this whole scheme of things. Yes, I believe that she's guilty. I believe hopefully some truth will come out, something will happen with this, but for the meantime, again, that's my opinion, that's how I take it. I think there were way too many left unanswered questions, and I think the only reasonable explanation for it is that Carole Baskin killed her husband, which is the greatest meme on the internet, no matter what form it's in. How guilty is Joe Exotic? I think, like I've explained before, we see that Joe Exotic was essentially a little bit delusional with fame. He wanted fame so much that he was willing to do anything for it, but at the same time he had an issue with being, I guess, too open a lot of the time. I think with the producer and the man who he hired to run the show and run a reality show, two separate things. I think with his whole he had like a shed on the zoo. I think that was burnt down or orchestrated to be burnt down by Joe Exotic. I think that's pretty clear. I think here was he finally came to his senses and realized that maybe he's been too open. There's been too much portrayed, there's been too much, or maybe it was just that the producer and his film crew caught something that Joe didn't want seen, whether that be like he was accused of euthanizing tigers. He was accused of many things, and I think it's a possibility that was caught on tape somewhere, that for some reason Joe just didn't want those films to be released to anybody. He didn't want anybody to see what he does. I think as far as the Carole Baskin ordered hit, that absolutely happened, and you can tell throughout the show that, yeah, sure, they may have edited it in a way that you come out of that believing that. However, I think there's more than enough evidence to show that, if not orchestrated by Joe Exotic, you would have never gotten to the places that you did, with the man being able to go and meet with Joe to get the money, with Joe having all these videos and different things online of him, oh, if I ever see Carole Baskin, I'll shoot her in the face, and I don't think Joe was completely there enough to say, like, oh, I can decipher reality from what this actually is. I think, to an extent, I think Joe Exotic didn't know that it was a possibility until he met the man from Vegas. I keep calling him the man from Vegas. I don't remember what his actual name is, but I think after Joe met that man, and that man essentially told him, like, yeah, I hired this guy, or this guy works for me, and he's able to, like, get rid of your problem with Carole Baskin. I think after that happened, he was like, oh, like this is a possibility. And I think Joe was easily convinced into paying up the money, or the partial amount of the money that he paid up. So I think Joe Exotic is definitely guilty for hiring a hit on Carole Baskin. I think there's more than enough, I don't know, mens rea, I think is the word, to show that he was premeditated and such. He was like, he should be in jail absolutely for the conspiracy to commit murder. And I think with Jeff Lowe, which is the guy's name, I just found out, Jeff Lowe. With Jeff Lowe, I think he becoming an informant and flipping, he definitely changed the story up a bit to make himself seem less guilty. But at the end of the day, you can't get rid of the facts, which are that this man gave him money. Like, Joe gave money to Jeff Lowe and his right-hand man to kill Carole Baskin. I think a couple of things to note about the show is, if you haven't yet, you definitely need to search up Jeff Lowe, and I believe his name is Michael Murdoch, I think, which is Carole Baskin's first husband, and they look identical, for one. And for two, I think there's something to be said about Doc Antle and the fact that he was in majority of the show until he wasn't. I think that has to do with maybe them like suggesting that he was a leader of a cult. I think that they took that spin on a couple of episodes that probably pissed him off a bit, and he decided, you know what, you guys got all your information that you're going to get from me, and we're parting ways. I don't want anything to do with this documentary. I haven't seen online whether or not he's said anything about this documentary. I'm going to look into it, but I'm sure if he did, it was probably something along the lines of, they portrayed me in this way when really I'm like this. And let's be honest, we saw the testimonies from the women that used to work there, and they would say that, oh yeah, he used to like marry half of us, and the other half he would make us get boob jobs, and he would make us do X, Y, and Z. Like, he's definitely running a sketchy organization over there. But I think with that being brought to light, he decided that he didn't want to take part in the documentary anymore, and so there was a lot that was left unanswered from him. I wouldn't be surprised if somebody decided to get their heads into there and figure out how to make a documentary, probably a couple of extra episodes just on him. So let's just jump straight to it. Let's talk about my review score and what I give this show. I've said this to many people, and I think the analogy is perfect. The Tiger King is McDonald's. Like, you hate to admit that you watched it or that you ate McDonald's. You hate to tell your friends to go and do it, but when they do, you're so happy. And it's one of those shows that you really shouldn't enjoy. Like, there's nothing to it that's better than any show out. I think the fact that it came out during the Corona time, the fact that it essentially was the perfect show for being in quarantine and being able to binge it. I mean, Netflix, I think, had this show in the back burner, or at least they had this show prepped, but not sure really when to release it. And I think the fact that they released it out all at once, that shows how opportunistic it was for them to release this show at this time. Because if you look at, for example, The Last Dance, that's being released on like a semi-weekly schedule. I think they're doing like 2 episodes every Monday. But like with that show, they wanted to take as much time. They wanted it to sit and marinate with people. They wanted it to be there so that you can think about what just happened in what episode. And I feel with Tiger King, they were just like, put the whole thing out because we need to capitalize on this. We have this story that's already been told a couple of times, because there's this podcast and there's other specials. I think like Dateline did a couple of episodes, but either way, this story has been told before, but we have some sort of an inside scoop. Let's get into it. Let's just drop this whole show right now, have everybody binge it during quarantine, and let's let the internet take it from there. So again, I think the show, I wouldn't recommend it to anybody. I wouldn't say it's worth a watch. I wouldn't say that they needed to watch it. However, when people have told me that they've watched it, I love discussing it with people who have. But I feel like a lot of the show has that whole Netflix curse, which I think I'll talk about in a different episode, but how how Netflix takes things and makes them far too long for no apparent reason. I mean, they are their own producing company, they are their own studio. Like, they can easily take some of these shows that are like 12 to 15 episodes and make them anywhere from 5 to 7 at most, but they decide not to, so it leaves you with a lot of filler. So all in all, what do I think of Tiger King? I would give it about a 4.5 on a scale of 10. Again, because of the amount of filler, because of the amount of loose ends, because of the amount of just questions that don't get answered and kind of keeps you on a leash. Like, it's kind of weird that they would do a show like this where you don't get answers for any of the questions that you ask inside the show, other than from the first episode when you know that Joe Exotic's in jail. You ask yourself, why is he in jail? And that's the only question that gets answered. Whether or not they answer the question of, like, they don't do any research, and like they did for Making a Murderer, which is why I think this is like the parody version of Making a Murderer, because at the end of the day with Making a Murderer, you got investigations were held, you got all the facts, you got everything that you needed to know to then inform yourself of a decision of whether or not he was guilty. But with this show, you're left with a lot of hearsay and conjecture, and well they did this, so I couldn't have been charged with this, and Carol Baskin had this to do with this, and it's a whole lot of just conjecture and hearsay, and it's super convoluted, but at the same time it gives you a junk food story that you want to listen to. So that's where I stand. 4.5 out of 10. Tiger King. Would not watch again, would not recommend to anybody, but if people have watched it, I would love to hear your thoughts. I'd love to talk to you guys about it. If you can, shoot me a DM. If not, maybe when we see each other in person, once this quarantine and stuff is all done, we can definitely talk about it. That is my review for the Tiger King. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, follow the podcast on Spotify, follow me on YouTube. I'm now on YouTube. Still working out the kinks of video and stuff like that, so I haven't really been able to upload it video. It's been a stagnant photo. I don't even know if this one will end up on YouTube. It probably will, but again, it'll be a stagnant photo until I figure out how I'm gonna do video. But thank you guys for listening, and put bacon on everything.